Okay, so we're now actually going to start building the plugin. So we're at the fun part where we actually get to make everything that we've done so far work. So we're very, very nearly there. This isn't going to be very complicated at all. So let's go ahead and define a jQuery plugin. So what we do is we do two parentheses here. We create a function within it, and then we append on passing in jQuery. So this will execute automatically. We pass $$ in there as well, which is the notation for jQuery. Basically, that's what we use to define jQuery. So in here, let's just go ahead and console log something, just so we can see that this is working. Remember, we're loading this in on our main page. So let's go ahead and refresh our browser, and you can see here that we've got hello. Now we've got this error down here because it says that object, which is the articles container that we selected earlier, has no method load more. Don't worry about that. It's because we haven't defined our plugin within this function here. So we'll go ahead and do that now, and then we'll do another console log just to check along the way that everything's working. First of all, though, because I've used JSLint to validate this, I'm going to go ahead and use strict. So let's go ahead and actually define the plugin now. So we do the $, which is jQuery, .fn, which is function, and this is load more. So this is the name of our plugin, load more. Now this is going to be a function, and in here we'll go ahead and console log you just called a plugin. So now that we've got this, when we refresh, it says you just called a plugin. So that is now this part here working. But we've got these options that we're passing into this function or this method, so we need a place to actually go ahead and read these. So we type options in here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a generic or sort of a variable that's going to represent this. So equals this. So basically what this is going to do is every time we want to refer to the object itself that's being selected with the plugin, i.e. this articles container, because we want access to everything in here, including this load more button, then we're going to go ahead and refer to it as self. It's just an easy way to refer to that again and again and again because we define it at the top here. Now what we also need to do is grab the settings, and we use the extend method with jQuery in jQuery to do this. So let's go ahead and create a settings variable, and we use jQuery extend, and inside of here we go ahead and pass in the options that we expect, and then the actual options that have been passed through as an object. So in here what we're going to do is we're going to say source. The default source is going to be nothing, and the default step is going to be 2. So let's just go ahead and space these out. You'll notice I'm comma separating these variables down and down and down and down. That's because we don't want to just keep using var over and over again. So what we want to do now is go ahead and create a variable that represents how many values have been stepped. So I'm just going to set this to 1 by default. And we also want to go ahead and pull in the template of each of the items, or the item that we've defined here, which is this. So we want this to represent the template that we want to duplicate over and over and over again. So in this case, I'm going to say item equals self. Remember, we're referring to self. .find. This will just find something by a selector. In this case, it's .item. So when you're using this plugin, your markup needs to have an element which has a class of item. But this isn't a problem because it allows us to be generic, and we can reuse this plugin over and over again with lots of different containers. So what we're now going to do is just define a few methods. So the first one is going to be finished. This is what's going to happen when there's no more results left. So when we get to the last 15, or when we get to the 15th article, we want to hide the items load button, which, remember, we gave a class of items load, so we can target that. So we also want to go ahead and create a method called append. So what this is going to do is it's going to actually loop through and append more of these items onto or inside of the items container. So again, it's really important that you have this generic class called items, and we also have a load method. So this is going to perform the Ajax request to the file. So that's the last method, so I'm going to end that with a semicolon. So we're going to start with load, because this is probably not the most important, because they all work together equally as important. But what this is going to do is it's going to Ajax with the URL that we've given, which is the settings.source. So basically the settings.source. And then it's going to, on success, basically just loop through all of the items that have been found in the JSON. So in here, this case, it will loop twice. And then it will use the template that we created here and duplicate that for how many times it's found. So don't worry if you're a little bit lost. It's maybe quite confusing to get your head around at first, but once it all starts coming together, it will become a lot easier. So what I actually want to do is go ahead and check the length of the source that's been provided, because if the source hasn't been provided, we don't want to do anything at all. So let's create a quick if statement down here. Remember, this is still within the load more function, but it's not actually part of these variables we're declaring. We've got a separate if statement down here. So let's go ahead and check settings.source, and we'll use the length property as part of that to determine whether this has been provided. Now, if it hasn't been provided, we want to go ahead and console log, just to silently warn the person that's trying to use this plugin that the source is required. So in this case, I'm going to say source required for load more. So otherwise, we'll say OK. So let's go ahead and refresh and check this. And it says OK. If we go ahead and happen to forget to include this, that would return a length of 0. So in this case, it says source required for load more. So we're providing a little bit of error handling there, just in case it's not used properly or that property is not provided, because of course a user could just omit this altogether. So what we're going to do now is, instead of console logging OK, which isn't useful at all, what do we want to do? Well, we want to go ahead and call the load method, or the load function that we created up here, which we haven't done anything with at the moment. Now we want to load this. Well, it's probably better to define the parameters that this takes first of all, and that is the start and the count. Now we already know what these are. The start is where we want it to start at, and the count is how many we want to display. Now the count is always going to be the step, but when we initially load this plugin, we want the start to be 1 and the count to be the step. Now we know that the step has been provided in the settings here, so we can just do settings.step. So now in the load method, we can go ahead and we can Ajax to the file, passing the data start and count, which will then be represented here and here. So it will load in what we initially request. If the step had been provided by the user when they use the plugin as 5, this would be sent through to here as 5. This would replace this default value. We would go down, this would be 5, and this would be passed to here. And when we Ajax, we subsequently would change the count to 5. So it all sort of flows into pulling out what we need from this. So the load method, let's go ahead and use the Ajax method in jQuery. And this is going to provide a URL. We need to provide a URL, which is going to be settings.source. So remember, this is the source that the user's provided up here. What we also need to do is, well, we don't need to, but I'm going to define that I want this to be a GET request. And I'm also going to define the data type I expect back. Although jQuery does handle this for you, I'm going to explicitly define it, just in case another developer coming over to this code sees it and they know that they're expecting a JSON response. So I'm also going to pass through some data to this JSON file. So in this case, it's going to be start, and this will be a certain number, and count, and this will be a certain number. So where do we get start and count from? Well, we get them from here and here. So we can just say start is start and count is count. So without going any further, let's just take a look at how this works, just in case there's any confusion. Let's go ahead and refresh here. Now under the network tab, if you refresh, let's just pull this open a little bit, you can see that we've actually ajaxed articles.php with a query string start1 and count2. So if we now go ahead and change this step to 5, that will be passed through to the Ajax request, and the data sent to the articles.php file will change to 5. So this, if we just open this here in a preview, we can see that we're getting this response from our server. We know that this is hitting this successfully and changing the count. So we know that this is all working now, so we can go ahead and implement a success callback. This is what's going to happen when everything works and the file's been hit, there were no errors. And we're not going to implement an error. You can do if you want. It'd probably be more sensible to implement some kind of error callback, but we'll leave it out for now. So the success callback will have a data property which contains all of the data that's been returned from that file. We know this is JSON, so we can use this as, we can loop through this, we can do what we want. So let's go ahead and create a items variable, and this is going to be data.items. Now jQuery has already parsed this JSON for us. We don't need to use the JSON object and the parse method to parse this. It's already parsed for us, so we can just access items. Now, if you're thinking, where does items come from? Well, remember, that's from here. So we're accessing data, which represents this whole thing here, and we're accessing items here. So now, if we just do a console log on items, you'll see that that gives us this object with, this is a description for article 1, this is a description for article 2, 3, 4, and so on. I'm actually just going to change this back to a step of 2, and you'll notice that that reflects there's only 2 objects. So now that we've got our objects back from our JSON file, we can go ahead and we can actually iterate through them. So in this case, I first of all want to check if the items have any, well, I want to check the length property. So I want to say if items.length. Then what do I want to do? Well, I want to go ahead and loop through each one. So I'm going to use jQuery to parse this to make it, to basically allow us to use the each method that jQuery provides for us. So basically for every loop, we have a callback function, which gives us an index, which is the position, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on, and the value, which is the actual value. So within this, every time we loop, what do we want to do? Well, we want to go ahead and we want to append the value. And we remember earlier we created this append here. So by appending, what we're doing is for every record, whether that's initial or when we click load more, we want to loop through the new items and create a new copy of that template we created here, and then append it within this items section. So let's go ahead and call the append method that we created and pass in the value. So remember, the value for each loop will be this and this. So we're passing this data through to the append method, which will append and, well, we'll clear up the appended thing later. So what we're going to now do is change the stepped count. So the stepped count is how many times we have clicked load more or initially loaded it in. So I'm going to say stepped equals stepped plus count. So this will just basically append on how many we've added onto. So outside of this if statement, we basically want to do a check to see whether this is the last record or not. So we create an if statement to say if data.last is true. So remember, inside of data, which is this whole thing here, this is the last property. If it's true, we want to go ahead and call the finished method that we created up here. And that will hide the, let's just comment this, hide the load more button. Append will append on. We'll look at that in just a moment. So let's go ahead and just check that this all works. So instead of appending, let's go ahead and just console log something. So in here, let's console log append. Oops. Append. So there we are. We have append output twice. If I change the step to 3, we'll have this output 3 times. So now what we need to do is build the functionality to take this, insert the title where it should be, insert the ID where it should be, insert the description where it should be, and basically do that for each of the items, appending this to this items wrapper here. So let's go ahead and fill this in now. So to append, what do we want to do? Well, the first thing we want to do is remove the initial item because we don't need it. So let's go ahead and create a couple of variables that we're going to need. That first one is name, and the second one is part, and we'll see where these are used in just a moment. So name and part. So we're going to say item.remove. Now, why do we do this? Well, remember we picked up the item here, so self.findItem. This is basically the template that we've been speaking about. We want to remove the initial item. That doesn't remove this because we've still got a copy of the item here, so we can go ahead and use that. But if we look at what's happened now, that just removes that initial item. See, it just disappears. So what we then want to do is we want to say for name in value. Now this might confuse you because where's value coming from? Well, remember we pass through when we append the value here. Let's go ahead and add that as a parameter. So for name in value, that's why we declare this variable name up here, so we didn't have to do this. So for name in value, we'll basically loop through each of these items. What we then want to do is check if the value has its own property name. And this is just a bit of sort of tidying up really and making sure that we don't mess things up here. So we're going to say if value has own property name. So we're checking if for each one it has its own property, and then we want to go ahead and create the part. So or basically find the part that we want to insert into. So let's just go ahead and just console log name here. Okay, so now what you can see is, and this hopefully should clear things up, for basically for two records, we loop through an ID, a title, and a description, and then an ID, a title, and a description, because what we want to do is we want to insert the ID into here, insert the title into here, and the description into here for two records. You'll probably already guessed, if I change this to 5, we're going to get 5 lots of these. So we're on the right track to going ahead and actually inserting these based on the property name, which is why we did the has own property check, the property name of the values that we return here, ID, title, and description. So what we want to do is create or assign a selector to this part variable. So we already declared this up here, we declared at the top of the function. So what we're now going to do is we're going to say item.find. We've already seen the find method, but this time what we're going to do is inside of here, we're going to go ahead and use a selector to find the data field where it equals the name, because we've got ID, title, and description. So in here, we're going to do a asterisk search for any item that has a data field equaling something in double quotes. So in here, what we want to go ahead and do is just concatenate on the name. So if we go ahead and do a console log, extremely useful for just debugging as we go or checking as we go. When we refresh, you can see here that for each one, we've now loaded in 2 spans, which are this span here and this span here, and a paragraph. So we can actually see these elements here. So now that we've got these elements as jQuery's objects, we've selected them, we can go ahead and simply just apply the text value to them. So the value of the JSON that we get back. So we first of all want to just do if part.length just to check that the items have actually been found, and then do part.text, and text, remember, puts text inside. So in this case I'll just write hello for now. We'll look at how we do this properly in a minute, and that will go ahead and do that. What we've not done is gone ahead and cloned it yet. So everything works here, but what do we want to do? Well, part.text, we need to get the value, which is, remember, the value that we pass in, and then we want to find the value at the property name that we're currently at. So again, we could do a console log on this, but let's go ahead and just clone the items just so we can see this working. So what we want to do is down here, outside of all of this, we want to go ahead and say item self.clone. So we're cloning this, and then what we want to do is append it to, where do we want to append it? Well, we want to do a search for the items. So we could just store this up here, I suppose. So we could just say items equals self.find items. So that's the items here, which represents the container. Let's just go to index.html container here. Now when we append to, it will append it here. So it doesn't append it after the actual container, it does it within it. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and do append to items. And let's go ahead and check out what this does. There we go. So we've got article 1 with the article description. They've all been placed in the right place. The load more button doesn't work at the moment. However, you'll be very pleased to know that the load more button doesn't actually require much more code. All we need to do is create a selector which allows us to go ahead and, or not a selector, an event handler, which allows us to go ahead and, on click, load in a certain value, so a stepped value if you like. So let's go ahead and add this event handler in here. So we're going to say self.find. So what do we want to find to attach an event handler to? Well, we want to attach items.load. Then we want to do an on method, and on a click we want to run a callback here. So what this is going to do is actually load. We're going to use the load method again. But this time, what do we put here and here? Well, because we already are incrementing the stepped value, we now know that the count, the reason we set this as 1 is because it's a 0 indexed, and the count will always be, well, let's just test this out. So when I go ahead and refresh now, we get 3 here. So we know that we want to start at 3. So it's always going to be 1 ahead. Remember when we looked at here, we wanted to go ahead and start at 3 and we get the next 2 here. So we know that this stepped value can be used because we increment it every time we load more results in. So if we go ahead and use stepped there, now what do we want to do in terms of the step? Well, we know that's in settings.step. So it's exactly the same as we call here. And we'll do a return false here just so we don't flip up to the top of the page. So when I refresh, load more simply loads more items in. It really is that simple. And the reason it's that simple is because we've created reusable functionality within our jQuery plugin. Now the only thing we've got left to do here now is when we load more up to 15, this load more button stays, so when I click it, nothing happens. That's a bit annoying for users. So let's just go ahead and finish this up by looking at what we created earlier, this if statement. So if data.last equals true, we know that when we refresh, and let's just keep an eye on our network tab, load more, you can see each of these loading in with a new start value. So I'm going to scroll down and click load more, load more, load more. Keep doing that till 15. Right, so now we've loaded in the last value here. So start is 15, count is 2. Let's go ahead and click on this and look at the response. So we can see here that last is true, whereas the one just before that, last was false. So for this, we now know that this is being called, and we can test that by coming up here and doing a console log. The last ones, or the last one. So refresh, let's go ahead and load more in. We'll keep doing this till we get to 15. Now we have the last one logged in our console. So instead of doing that, which isn't much use, what do we want to do? Well, it's obvious. We want to go ahead and hide the load more button. That's the only thing we want to do. It's just purely to not annoy people and just make this work a little bit better. So we do self.find items load. Remember, that's the button that we created, and then we remove it. That's it. So let's go ahead and test this out. In fact, I'll change the step value just so we are getting a little bit of a different take on things. So we're now loading in 3. When I click load more, we're loading in another 3, load more, another 3, load more, another 3. Now when I hit it this time, 12, 13, 14, 15, that will be the last amount to be loaded in. So I hit load more and the button disappears because that was the last amount to be loaded in. So we have created a backend that outputs JSON. We've created a jQuery plugin that can be reused on any other container. So we could even look at an example of reusing this on another container. If we copy this, paste it, and change this to articles 2 or something, we could go ahead and just say copy this plugin, paste articles 2, and we'll have the step as 5. So this is completely independent now. If we just close this off, we can load more on this, which will load another 3, and on this we could load more, which will load another 5 to 10, and again to 15. So let's scroll down. So we can use this on different containers with different data sources. So this is a completely reusable, won't interfere with anything else on the page. And there we go, that's it. We've built a load more plugin with jQuery.